Hello, this is CurtisCroweThePhotoPro here to explain to you how ISO works. Now, I call it ISO, so if you are confused throughout the video, just refer to ISO being ISO. What is ISO? It's a throwback term in which photographers used to get for certain types of film. You would get a 1600 speed ISO film, and they would put that in there, and then they would be stuck at that ISO for their entire shoot. So then they would only have to be able to, or the only thing they would be able to control to change is your aperture and shutter speed. And additional lighting and stuff like that if you are the more high-end photographer. So what does that mean for digital? Because digital doesn't use film. Well, what that means is they have a way to boost light with software inside the camera. What this does is it kind of mimics the effect of ISO, which causes grain as you go higher, but it boosts the amount of exposure that's in the image. So there is a benefit, but there is a drawback. So obviously you don't want high grainy images unless you're looking for that look. A lot of black and white photos love the grainy look. So you might shoot in black and white for dark environments with high ISO, or just shoot with high ISO and make it black and white to get that grainy look. Now what we're going to show you is some sample images of how ISO affects your images today. Now if you go too high, it's not just grainy, it's mushy, it's color splotches. There's a lot to it that will make your image less desirable in 99% of situations. And we're going to go over that for you right now.
Alright, so to get started, I just want to give a minor disclaimer, and that is every camera handles ISO differently. Some cameras handle it better than others, so what you're seeing here is not an exact representation of your ISO capabilities. It's just of the Canon 70, my personal Canon 70Ds and 50mm lens with this particular lighting setup that I had set up for this still life. Now, the still life, it has a range of low lights, highlights, and midtones. So let's go ahead and get started with examining the image. Now this is ISO 100. As you can tell, there's not a lot of grain even when you zoom in on these midtones here. You see very, very little texture. If you go over the highlights, there's virtually no grain. And obviously as you go darker and stuff like that, you'll see a little bit. But even that's pretty dang clean. Now let's go to ISO 200. A little bit more grainy, as you can tell here. Our highlights are still looking pretty good. And dark tones are still looking good, not too colorful yet. But it's ISO 200. It's still pretty dang close to the ideal lighting setting, or ISO setting, I should say. So here we got ISO 400. Now a lot of people swear by ISO 400. As you can tell, the grain is just starting to creep in, but a lot of people seem to think that ISO 400 handles colors better. But I will zoom in at the end and show you all the images back to back, and you can kind of determine which one has the best color out of all of them. And so yeah, let's go to ISO 800. Okay, so before zooming in, I'm starting to see the ISO now. Starting to see grain in the bottle, grain in the midtones without even zooming in. Grain starting to creep in through the highlights. As you can tell in these midtones, it's getting a little rough. But this image is still very usable, if that's what I was going for. And then we go ISO 600 or 1600. And now again, it's getting more noticeable, as to be expected. We're starting to lose detail in the sharpness of these holes, and we have more grain up here, as you can tell, and highlights are starting to look a little hazy. And that's ISO 1600 on the Canon 70D. Now we're going to go up to 3200. Now this is to the territory where I would really not want to push my camera. Sure, my camera can handle a lot higher than 3200, but it doesn't handle it well. And if I'm trying to make images that I'm going to be presenting to a client, I want tack sharp images with no mush, little grain, little to no grain, and no color splotches. As you can tell here, you're starting to see color splotches starting to creep in, little green tones and different colored tones in here that are just starting to creep in. Obviously, I don't even have to zoom in on this anymore. Even the highlights, I don't have to zoom in on anymore to see that grain. But we're going to zoom in on the dark right here. And yes, that is looking very rough. That is no good. 6400. Now, this is starting to look like a cell phone picture at this point. I mean, at this point, shooting at f5.6 at 62 or 6400 ISO, I would probably have a better image shooting it from a cell phone, because then I'm shooting a wide angle, which can bring in a little bit more light. But as far as ISO grain goes, I mean, this is starting to look terrible. This is actually dreadful. No doubt, dreadful. I mean, look at this spider. Look how sad this spider is. He's like, I'm so rough and rigid right now with all that ISO grain. So now we're going to go to the final image. And still at f5.6. This is the max ISO that my camera goes to on default settings. I might be able to push it up to 24,000 or 25,000 with a couple setting tweaks. But I never want to go that high, so I don't even set it in my camera. And yeah, this looks like a webcam off a 10-year-old laptop. That's how bad this ISO is looking. Don't have to zoom in at all, but let's just say I did want to zoom in. Look at that. That looks like I'm legitimately. Close your eyes for a second. Now open them. Does it look like you're looking at a carpet? Because to me, this looks like carpet. That's how bad the grain is. As you tell here in the gray. Just a lot. Now, my camera, I will say, handles color splotches a little bit better than other cameras. If you have the T3i, that camera was terrible at splotching colors when it did high ISO images. The darkness over here, just terrible. You lose so much detail. It's hard to tell what's grain and what's holes over here in the Minecraft dirt cube. I mean, this is never going to be considered usable. Now, I did include one more bonus image, and that's what happens with ISO when you introduce flash, because it does, in some situations, help clean up your ISO grain, because ISO looks cleaner in highlighted areas opposed to midtones or shadowed areas. So let's take a look at that. Now, this is pre-edit, so it does look a little washed out using the flash. And let's be honest, this is indoors, still light. And I was using a speed light, so it's not like the best lighting situation. But as you can tell, there's a lot less grain, noticeable grain in the mouse and the square attachment. In the light areas, there's just less noticeable grain. And even in the dark tones, I mean, I can see a little bit more detail there opposed to there. So that's something to keep in consideration when you're in a low light situation. You want to bump up that ISO. Maybe you want to try to find another way to bring in more light. Drop your aperture, lower your shutter speed. But just so you know, with every image, your ISO does get worse. Now we're going to go ahead and go fit, because we said we were going to look at the images zoomed out side by side to see the color changes. So before we do that, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the one with flash. There we go. So now we're just looking at the ones with flash. So side by side, you can look up here in the corner here to see what settings are being used. But we're at ISO 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400, and then 12,800. So as you can tell, there is changes to the color. And I wouldn't say that 400 is necessarily better than any of the other settings as far as color goes, but some people swear by it, so I figured it's worth mentioning to you. If you look here, there's a lot of color here. I'm going to go ahead and change it again. That's 200. That's 400. Not seeing enough changes in color in order for it to make me shoot at 400 instead of 100 in the future. So I hope this was informational for you. I hope this helps you out when you're on your next photo shoot. Always keep in mind of your ISO and how that's going to affect your grain when you zoom in, go into post-processing, all that other jazz. Anyway, this has been Curtis Crowe, the Photo Pro, and as always, toodles.